Hey, welcome back PetaPixel viewers. It is Chris Niccolls here, and today I have got my hands finally on the Fujifilm GFX100 version 2. I've been really excited to get my hands on this camera because we've got a brand new design here from Fujifilm, and it's a gorgeous camera when I first look at it. Definitely a step up from the 100S, which we've always loved. But this camera has its fair share of controversy. We're going to get into that. It's also designed to maybe push the boundaries of what a medium format camera is expected to do, so there's lots of good stuff there as well. But rather than to get right into handling and the specs on the camera, we have a model coming. He's going to help us out. He should be here any minute. We're really excited to do that shoot for you first. Okay, so to test the Fuji GFX100 version 2, we wanted to have somebody slightly better looking than either Jordan or myself. So we got Jared Clark here, professional model here in Calgary. Thanks so much for helping us out, Jared. We really appreciate it. So for today's shoot, we've brought out the Westcott FJ400. We love this because it's a fully wireless, battery-powered light. I'm using the wireless transmitter. Now, because the Fujifilm GFX100 II has a flash sync speed maximum of 125th of a second, I'm getting more ambient light than I might want. So I'm going to slap some ND filters here on the front, and I'm using a tighter aperture. And what I'm going to try to do is basically outcompete some of that sunlight, get that background to show up a little bit darker. I've also got a softbox on here. So what I like about this is even though the FJ400 is totally portable and wireless, it's got plenty of power to go through that box, to get past the NDs and still light Jared up beautifully. So let's get to it. And again, big thanks to Westcott for being our preferred lighting partner here at PetaPixel.
This is our town, got a whole set of rules, dangerous. New York City set of tools, going down Chinatown, Gucci blade, Cartier. Too much Hennessy, got that West Coast fade. The left to right, left to right, tell me who's that back out of fight. Throwing down, oh back up, back up. Throwing down, oh back up, back up. Play your cards right, cause if you wanna fit in, we wanna high with the stakes and it's all bets in. Who's ready, who's ready? Come and get it, who's ready, who's ready? Come and get it, look at me now.
Jared, huge thanks, man. You did such a great job. Thanks for helping us test the portrait capabilities of this camera. And you're a great model to work with. And you should check out Jared Daniels' work. I didn't know this, but you're a fantastic R&B musician, so check out that work. But also, big thanks to houseofwild.co, the model agency that hooked us up with you. And we had a great time today. Thank you. Thank you. All right, let's test out the rest of this camera. Okay, so we had a fun shoot. Now let's get to the meat of the episode and talk about handling here on the camera. So the first thing that you notice here, beautiful design. I mean, I love the aesthetics of this. I really like that angled top plate. I think they've done a really good job actually making this camera sexy, but stand out from a lot of the other cameras on the market. The grip is fantastic. It's got this cool new Bishamon style rubberized grip. The only thing I question about the rubber work on here is actually the port doors. I mean, they do have a good rigidity to them, but they're very thin. But when they're open, they're kind of flippy floppy, and that can get in the way when you're trying to put plugs and stuff in. And then you definitely want to make sure that you've closed them solid just to make sure that everything's still sealed. Anyways, seems to be okay. I do like the position of the quick menu button. It's easy to find, but I don't feel like I'm going to press it by accident. Dials are nice now. They both have a very similar feel to them that's different from the older cameras. They both have a push-in function as well. And then these three buttons right behind the shutter. At first I was like, oh, they're not labeled, but I actually really like it because they correspond complete with this beautiful, basically 2-inch LCD panel on top. It's humongous. I can customize what those three buttons do, but I like that I have the visual confirmation right there on the screen. Now the screen is nice. I know I'm an outlier. I still find the fact that it's always on even when the camera's off confusing to me, but I do understand the merit of being able to seal your settings while the camera's off. And something that we haven't seen before, a selector switch to go between movies and stills to keep all of your controls separate. On the back of the camera, the things I note, the AF on button's in a nice position. I can easily reach it with my hand on the grip. Also, I can flick the autofocusing controls from single to continuous to manual without having to take my hand away from the camera. As usual, with a Fujifilm camera, we don't have a joy pad, a directional control pad, but we do have the autofocusing joystick, and this is your primary way of navigating the menus. It works fine with practice. Again, like most Fujifilm bodies, the touchscreen will work with the quick menus. It will work with autofocusing on the screen, but it doesn't let you navigate the menus at all, so you are stuck using that autofocus joystick. Now, as far as all the ports go, it's interesting that we have a PC sync here, so there's definitely a nod there to studio flash usage with this camera. Over here, we have an interesting layout. Now, we've got CF Express Type B and UHS-2 SD card slot. And that's nice because the 100S, it just had twin SD card slots. This will absolutely be necessary, though, when we talk about fast shooting, so I'm glad that we have that. Battery style is the same as what you'll find on a lot of the Fujifilm bodies, as well as the GFX100S. It's our classic Fujifilm WP235 battery, we're getting SEPA rated for about 510 shots. That is more than what we get on the 100S, but it's still not anywhere close to what we get on the 100. We have an Ethernet port here all by its lonesome, and then we've got a mic jack, we've got headphone jack on the other side of the camera just here with this port, and interestingly enough, we now have a full HDMI port. That's great. And last, of course, we've got the USB-C port here, and the only thing I wish is that we had two of them, just because, you know, with this USB-C port you can charge the camera but also connect it to external SSD drives, for example, to record stills and video, and it'd be nice to have the option to charge the camera while you're also externally recording, but in most situations it's not going to be an issue. All right, displays time. So first on the back, we get this beautiful 3.2 inch, well over 2 million dot display. It doesn't fully articulate as much as I normally like. I mean, this is very familiar though to Fujifilm users, but it works well for low to the ground shots and verticals and things like that. What's a really big upgrade though here is now we have a removable viewfinder, 9.44 million dots. Now at 60 hertz, that 9.44 million dots is at a beautiful 1.0 times magnification factor. I mean, very bright, very large, beautiful to compose with. If you do need 120 hertz refresh rate for sports and action, you can accept the magnification, go down to 0.77 magnification with a bit of a crop. You lose some resolution, but it's still really nice detail, and it'll give you that fast hertz rate if you really need it. Let's talk about the IBIS unit in the GFX100 version 2. So this is drastically improved from what we've seen before. I mean, we're up to 8 stops of stabilization, and it's actually working very well. I mean, not only just for composing, but for getting good handheld shots. You can see a shot that I took here, quarter of a second, pretty good. Am I gonna get the full 100 megapixel resolution, all the beauty the sensor offers? No. But when you are hand holding on the street or in lower light situations, you need the stability, this will provide it. Okay, now it's time to talk about autofocusing on the GFX100 version 2, and the biggest change that we have here now is we've got the subject detection modes that we have from the other Fujifilm bodies, like the XH2 for example. All the planes and trains and automobiles, birds, wildlife, face detect, eye detect. It's great that we now have it on a medium format platform. Now earlier in the day we had an opportunity to do our classic autofocus test, but not with who you might think it is. Let's go to that now. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is one of our famous running autofocusing tests that Jordan normally does, but turns out Jared used to play junior football, so he's gonna relive his quarterback days. He's gonna do the test for us. He's assured us he's gonna make the same like yucky faces that Jordan makes when he runs. So let's give it a shot here. We're gonna fire at 8 frames per second, see how it does. Beauty, that was great, that was great. Okay, so we've had a chance to look at the files, and just for your information there, we use the 40-100 zoom at f4. This does have a linear motor, and it's quite a fast focusing motor, and that's why I wanted to choose it. The hit rate that we got on the autofocusing test is okay, not great. I mean, again, look, to give it context, this isn't going to compete with the Nikon, Canon, or Sony full frame bodies and tracking modes. I would say that it's actually going to be a little bit behind the Fujifilm bodies like the XH2 as well in their APS-C lineup, but it did work very predictably and it worked as we expected. So you'll find here that autofocus does a pretty good job. Sometimes though it's just a little bit behind, especially in the running test. We did some examples here at 8 frames per second to really push it, and I found that if I set my focus priority to focus instead of release, I would certainly get a higher hit rate, but I would also get less frames per second. Okay, so for action and sports and stuff like that, you know, it's good. It's certainly the best autofocusing medium format camera ever made, but that wasn't a super high bar to begin with. But what about when it comes to just like portraits and people shooting at comfortable distances? There's actually a lot of people complaining on their 100s and 100Ss that they were still not always getting the iris in focus. Often the camera go to the eyebrow or behind the eye. So how did the 100 version 2 do? Well, certainly improved from what I've seen even on the 100S. I mean, taking pictures here of Jared, I found the hit rate to be quite good. There were still the occasional shots like you can see here where it may have gone on the eyebrow just in front of his iris. But honestly, for the most part, when you're looking at it at a proper viewing distance, it's still going to be very acceptable, and most of the shots were absolutely bang on right on the iris. So I think as far as your hit rate goes for portrait work, you're going to enjoy this much better than you ever have on any other Fujifilm medium format camera. Now, of course, for portraits and stuff, it doesn't really matter what lens you use. I mean, shooting somebody walking forward or backwards, it did a pretty good job. But if I was going to use this for street photography or, you know, a bit more fast-paced action, keep in mind that the results are very lens dependent. I mean, there's some lenses in the Fujifilm medium format lineup that focus quite quickly. There's others that are fairly ponderous, so just keep that in mind when you're trying to get the best results. As for using this as like a sports or wildlife camera, I just don't think we're there yet. You do you, but I really think I would stick to an APS-C platform or a full frame platform for that kind of work. Okay, so we've talked about autofocus, we've talked about burst rates. What about how long you can sustain those burst rates? So the buffer on the GFX100 version 2, I'll just say it's very impressive. So I really like that we now have CF Express Type B cards. They're very fast as far as transfer rates go. And even shooting lossless compressed at 8 frames per second, it will go and go and go. I mean, to the point where I just quit shooting because we're already into hundreds of frames. I think it'll cap out, over 300 shots. But what I really want to see was what will happen if we go to an SD card. So putting a fast SD card, UHS 2, into this camera, I was still getting 60 shots in RAW before it slowed down. I mean, that's not bad. At 8 frames per second, that's still a fair amount of time where I can just hold down the button and shoot. And if I'm doing JPEGs, it'll just go infinitely. So I was actually really impressed with how long and how sustained I could keep up the shooting. Okay, we're going to talk about image quality here in just a bit, but before we get to that, I just want to talk about a new film simulation mode. I mean, got to give it to Fujifilm. They're great at making all these. And we now have Reala, mimicking their Reala color negative film. It's a beautiful general purpose film simulation mode. Nice colors, natural contrast, nothing too crazy, nothing too saturated. So I've been shooting on it all day, and you guys get some samples here of that. It's pretty nice. You could happily use that as a new standard if you wanted to. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty of what's actually going on in the image quality, because after all, getting the best image quality is usually why we buy these medium format cameras. So now we're going to get into talking about bit depth and image quality here, and this is where some of the controversy comes into play. So let's get through it. So first off, this is a over 100 megapixel sensor, same resolution we've seen in other cameras like the GFX100 and the 100S models. And it is actually essentially the same silicone. There may be some tweaks to the way the micro lenses are arranged and what's going on in the background, but it's essentially the same chip that we've seen before. Okay, but what we really have to get into is bit depth here. So this is a 16-bit shooting camera, just like we've seen on the previous Fujifilm cameras. And I mean, it's a beautiful file type. You get it when you're shooting single shot mode. If you go into continuous mode, the camera does go down to 14-bit, but honestly, the difference between 16-bit and 14-bit in your final product is largely invisible to people. It's really not a big deal. So we would happily shoot at 14-bit all day long. And this is basically the exact same image quality that we've seen out of the other Fujifilm bodies, which is to say, I mean, it's the best, right? I mean, this is a fantastic sensor. Where the controversy comes in is this. So Fujifilm advertised the GFX version 2 as having twice the readout speed that we've seen before, and that's sort of kind of true, okay? You see, Fujifilm really wanted to push the shooting speed on this camera and open up the versatility to get into some action, some movement, some sports, maybe street photography, definitely. And what they want to do is unlock that 8 frame per second mode. But the problem was, the older sensor just wouldn't read out fast enough. So in 14-bit modes, we're looking at roughly 160 milliseconds, okay? When we then go to 8 frames per second, the sensor readout's faster. It goes roughly around the 70 millisecond mode. This is great. This is what unlocks the faster shooting speed, but the bit rate is dropping. It's actually dropping down to the equivalent of 12 bits. But when you bring these 8 frame per second files into software like Lightroom or Capture One, they say that they're 14-bit, but you're only getting the information of a 12-bit file. So we talked to Jim Casson recently on our podcast. He gets into a lot of what's going on here, but what we're basically doing is giving up dynamic range going down to a 12-bit file, even though it says it's a 14-bit file. But let's look at an example here. When you really push the shadows, look at the difference between the 12-bit and the 14-bit file here, you can see the difference in dynamic range that we're getting. In the long run, I think this is a perfectly fine compromise. I mean, 12-bit still has lots of detail, lots of dynamic range, but the problem is that they're not really being upfront about it. You think you're getting 14 bits and you're not. And we just feel like Fujifilm could have been more upfront so that you know and are educated as to what is actually happening when you make these choices. I mean, that's why you watch us here on the show. Now, when you are shooting at this 8 frame per second mode, keep in mind that you're still getting the size of 14-bit files, so we're not getting any improvement to how long the buffer can go or anything like that, or how much space it'll take up on your cards. So you're still gonna get the size of 14 bits, you're just getting the dynamic range of 12. So again, I don't think it's a bad compromise to get the faster shooting speed when you need it, but if you do want to get the best image quality possible out of your camera, avoid the 8 frames per second when you don't have to. Stick to 5 or lower, or shoot single shot and get those 16-bit files. So that was one of the big headlines. The other big headline on the sensor, we now have a new base ISO of 80. And what we found there is we do get a slight dynamic range improvement over what we've seen on the 100S or the 100. It's not huge. It's certainly not a third of a stop like you would expect. It is there. The image quality on this sensor is fantastic as always, but if you're looking for something that's gonna really be substantially better than what we've seen before on their other 100 megapixel sensors, we're not there yet. So we have some very substantial and meaningful upgrades when it comes to stills, but by far one of the most interesting things about this camera is how far they've upgraded its video capabilities. So, updated video capabilities on a medium format camera, is it gonna work well? Let's go to Jordan Drake to find out.
Okay, Jordan here to talk about the video performance on the GFX100 version 2. And going back to when the GFX100 and 100S came out, I was actually pretty impressed with how capable those cameras were for capturing video. You know, the quality was quite nice on it, but I definitely wouldn't recommend using them as your primary video camera. I think they were a nice hybrid option. If you've got one for stills, you can capture some pretty nice looking video, but it wouldn't be my first choice for like a dedicated video camera. But now with the GFX100 version 2, Fujifilm has just thrown an absolute raft of video features at this camera. So let's find out, does this make it a truly compelling option as your primary video camera? Okay, well, what's new? Well, first of all, we do have 8K recording as the headline feature, but we also get 4K recording up to 60 frames per second now. And you can capture this in H.264, H.265, and even ProRes, so you've got a lot of flexibility with the codecs. We also have a huge variety of formats that we can shoot in, utilizing different portions of the sensor. Anamorphic shooting is also supported with D-Squeeze built right into camera. Basically, these features mean that the GFX100 version 2 is compatible with a whole bunch of lenses for a lot of different formats. We also gained the new f-log2 profile with its expanded dynamic range that we first saw in the XH2S. Now, bear in mind, the XH2S is a camera with a super fast SAC sensor that enabled it to read out in 14-bit mode. Here on the GFX100 version 2, we're doing all of our video capture in 12-bit mode, so I suspect the XH2S will still have a slight DR advantage when you're shooting the f-log2 profile. There's some other stuff on this camera we've been asking for a long time. This is the first Fujifilm mirrorless body that has tap-to-track video autofocus. If you want to have the camera follow non-human subjects, this is really great and very intuitive. And we get waveforms, my favorite way to meter out a scene, but not just regular luminance waveforms. No, we also get an RGB parade, so you can actually tell which color channels are clipping. Now, as far as the thermals go on this, in room temperature, I was able to record both 8K 24 frames per second and 4K 60, the two most demanding modes, for over an hour and 15 minutes before the camera overheated. So this is actually really good performance, but if you do need better thermal performance than that, this is actually compatible with Fujifilm's fan accessory. I do have to say, though, it's a little more cumbersome to actually mount it when you've got this three-way tilt display instead of the fully articulating display that we see on the XH and XS series bodies. Okay, but what is the actual video quality like? Well, like all recent Fujifilm bodies, if you're using f-log2 or the Eterna profile, the color and contrast coming out of this camera is just beautiful and very easy to work with. However, due to the very high resolution of this sensor and relatively slow readout, every record mode on this camera has compromises. If you look at the 8K recording on this, not only does it give you an absolutely massive 1.5 times crop, which means you're actually recording with less surface area than a full frame camera, but it also has really bad rolling shutter, which means you're not going to be able to move the camera or film fast moving subjects with this. Now, this is most noticeable in 8K, but all of the high resolution modes are going to give you the same kind of limitation. You're going to be cropping the sensor and you're going to be dealing with pretty slow rolling shutter. The most usable of these is their Cine mode, which actually uses the full width of the sensor, but with a heavy 2:3:5:1 kind of scope aspect ratio. That way you're going to be getting full width of the sensor, but you're still going to have to deal with pretty bad rolling shutter. Jump over to 4K recording, however, and now suddenly we can record the full width of the sensor in standard aspect ratios, and all of a sudden the rolling shutter drops dramatically. That's because the camera is now binning, which I have to admit does reduce the sharpness and low light performance of the sensor. That said, the footage in this mode does look quite good, and I'm not seeing a lot of issues with especially moire, which can be a real problem with it, but it's not going to give you the kind of resolution that you'd see with, a high resolution full frame camera that's shooting oversampled footage like a Sony A1 or a Nikon Z8. So Fujifilm has put a huge amount of effort into making this a very compelling video body. Would I actually use one as my primary video camera? Sadly, I'm going to have to say probably not, and if I did, I would only utilize the 4K capture on this camera, and that's because these high-resolution sensors just aren't really optimized for video. It really reminds me of the Sony a7R5, a camera with awesome video features when you looked at it on a spec list, but because it was a high-resolution, slow-reading sensor, the actual video performance and quality just wasn't really there. The best Fujifilm body for video capture, in my opinion, is still the XH2S. Even though it's APS-C, it has a very fast stacked sensor that allows it to read out in 14-bit mode, capturing oversampled footage. And I love a lot of the really cool new video features we've got, like the tap to track, the RGB parade waveform, and I'd love to see some of those come to the APS-C bodies in the future, but only time will tell if it will.
Okay, so how do I feel about this camera? So the things that Fujifilm are really pushing on this camera, the faster readout speed, well, we know that that does give it 8 frames per second, but with a dynamic range hit, and it's still not something I would use that often. Certainly the video capabilities, and they are impressive, it's just that the medium format platform isn't an ideal video camera. The sensor is just not really ideal for that application. But then when you look at all the stuff that they didn't really talk about, things like the improved IBIS, the better autofocusing capabilities, the super sexy design, the fact that this is still compact and light enough to carry around like I would a 100S, but with better battery life, the amazing displays, I mean, really go on and on. I mean, they've really improved this camera to the point where I feel like it easily justifies the extra cost that we're looking at. What we can see is that Fujifilm is absolutely pushing the medium format cameras to be as versatile as possible, and that's a good thing. I mean, that's really an interesting step in the right direction. I don't think we're quite there yet, but we've got so many upgrades here to make this the nicest Fujifilm medium format camera reviews today, and I mean, I would choose this over, honestly, any other medium format camera on the market right now. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed it and found it educational. Big thanks again to Jared Daniel for helping us out. He was a fantastic model, and leave your comments below. Let us know what you think. Let us know if you have any questions about this camera. Definitely check out our podcast as well. We did cover a lot of this sensor in our previous podcast. Definitely watch that, but we always have more shows coming out this channel, or you can go to all your favorite podcasting apps. Just look for the PetaPixel podcast. Big thanks to everybody for watching the show. We'll see you soon. Bye.